Last time we talked a little bit about when not to use intuition, specifically when you're on the deductive arm of that inductive hypothetical deductive spiral of William Whewell. That's the time to not use your intuition and go with your gut. So it's important that that particular time be where we're doing the hard test of what we want to know rather than letting our intuitions or sixth sense guide our conclusions. When you're on the side of your analysis, it's nice to say, okay, maybe I did find the results I was looking for, but even at that point, think creatively, think intuitively about what could have gone wrong. Are there some compounds in the data? Are there some problems? Do I have the results I have because of one or a very small number of people? So it's important to go through a few points mentioned in the book. Our lived experience does not count as research. That said, sometimes you can take things from your life. You can take your Fitbit or Garmin data, and that is your experience. So you can fill out surveys on successive days. But it's important that you know why you are collecting that data and what you are looking at. I guess in terms of the lives of people I know, some people I know are dealing with chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, they're gathering a lot of data and they're looking at all the variables and they're trying to figure out what's associated with maybe high symptom days or extreme fatigue. In that respect, the information is systematic. But if we're thinking about just our lives, the way we're living them, our experience has no comparison group. We don't really know what our conclusions would be, our feelings about something, unless we'd have that comparison group. For that reason, experience is confounded. You might be particularly happy or upset because of something else in your life and then attribute it, well, I didn't like class today because I didn't like the instructor or the way that he was talking about, or I really liked class because I was really happy that day. Research is better than experience because it's systematic, but at the end of the day, we also need to keep in mind that research is probabilistic. It's possible that you know some things about you that would invalidate what is true for the average person. And so before in the book, they talk, for example, about the fact that the catharsis model of aggression is not good, that blowing off steam does not necessarily make you feel better. But there are some people for whom, say, physical activity is helpful, like people playing basketball over at the gym in the before times. It's important to kind of keep that in mind, especially when you're talking about research articles that have to do with the public, journalism, because often a journalist doing a paper will try to either criticize a paper or support a paper with what I heard someone call man who statistics. I know a man who did this or that. One thing I've been involved in is how to change college course schedules so that people do not consume alcohol quite so much. So one of the issues here is that phenomenon called Thirsty Thursdays. And sometimes if you don't have any classes on Friday, that's going to lead to, I'm going to have a really long weekend, Friday, Saturday, and I'll get my homework done on Sunday. And when I would talk with reporters or people on the radio, people would call and say, well, I'm a college student and nothing's going to stop me from drinking. And that really isn't the point of research. Research is about generally across the population, would this cause a change? So for example, unsurprisingly, maybe at Missouri, and maybe at some point we can talk about the research and the media fallout from it, having an early Friday class actually cuts drinking among the average college student by about 2 drinks. for that day. And so, taken across the semester, taken across the year, across all the people, that's a fairly large intervention relative to the other interventions that we do to try to reduce college drinking. You may have noticed, for example, the DARE community will put up these signs in Ellis Library that will say, people who drink alcohol are much more likely to fail classes, things like that. Well, those programs are not as effective as simply saying, make an early Friday class. Surprisingly, though, I mean, and we can get more into the guts later, that effect is stronger for women than men, because unsurprisingly, given the choice between staying out late on Thursday night drinking and showing up for Friday class, the women tend to show up for class more than the men. It's important to think about what a comparison group is. And, as in the book, they talk about Brad Bushman's study of aggression, or in my little study, looking at people who do and don't have an early Friday class, we need to look at not only the effect of the intervention, but also what happens when we don't have the intervention. One of the conclusions out of the study I did is, if you really want to know about this, rather than just looking at Missouri student reports, you need to go in and do an experiment. And maybe some years have early Friday classes and some years not have them. Confounds are variables that you did not include in your study, or effects that are present that you did not measure. So, for example, to kind of run with this example of early Friday classes, if freshmen at Missouri, for example, had a lot of choice in when they would take classes, maybe it's those students who decide, you know what, an 8 a.m. Friday class is for me. Maybe those people are systematically different than students who end up in later classes. So, it's important to keep in mind such things as major, or maybe abstaining from alcohol as a lifestyle when you're thinking about a study. And one of the nicest ways of controlling for confounds is to do an experiment where we randomly assign people to conditions. When you can only observe things and do observational studies, all you can do is your best effort, gather as much information about the people that you can, and conduct analyses afterward to see if things were conditional on maybe some unmeasured variable or some set of variables that you didn't include in your original analysis. And here we have Brad Bushman's study. Brad was actually a graduate student at the University of Missouri when I interviewed for a job here. And speaking of statistics and so forth, he was a joint undergraduate statistics major and a psychology major. But one of the nice things about his study is he randomly assigned people to one of three groups. And when he designed that study, he was thinking about maybe some alternative explanations for a catharsis effect if it did happen. So in his first group, this first section, the little pink bar on the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the figure, he just had people sit quietly. And in the next group, he had them punch a bag, and then punch a bag with the picture of the Confederate on it. So if you've not read Chapter 2, the point of his study was to have a Confederate, that is, someone who was part of the experiment and not really just another student, pretend to be another student, and then criticize something that the participant had written. And Steve, the partner, was really obnoxious and rude to the person. And people were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. This first group is a control condition relative to doing something, punching a bag or punching a bag with seed space on it. This second group is kind of a control group as well, because these people are doing something that's an activity. So if just moving around is going to make you less angry, that punching bag is that particular condition. But making it up close and personal and putting Steve's face on it was the experimental intervention. And based on this, they did an analysis of variance and found that the means levels of aggression that people reported were lowest in the group that was just sitting quietly and highest in the group that was punching the bag with Steve's face on it. As I mentioned before, research is probabilistic. It doesn't apply to even everybody in your study because we know that people vary quite a bit. It doesn't explain all the cases all the time. And there are exceptions, and there are exceptions when you try to generalize that to other people. So the text talks a lot about research versus your intuition. And just thinking about things with your intuition does have some problems. The chapter makes a great deal of the point that you can't go through your life being an intuitive thinker. And this relates to my point that you can't do the whole science thing, that spiral in intuitive mode. There has to be some areas in it where you critically examine or think about why you might have been wrong. So perk up your ears. One of the things in the book that are some major points that they want to make about how you think about data is to think about these biases, and there are 5 of them. And we'll go through them, we'll go through the terms, and we can think of some examples. So the first one is your intuition can be biased because you're swayed by a good story. Someone will tell you something and you'll say, oh, sounds good to me. And the textbook gives an example of surgeons who were doing breast cancer surgery. And because breast cancer at that point was a really hard, difficult, aggressive disease, they thought that it makes only sense that when we operate, we should also be aggressive. So they would do radical mastectomies and so forth. And it's important to get at the data behind that. So just by virtue of life, my wife had breast cancer 3 times. And the first time we went to a hospital and the doctor said, oh, well, you have cancer, so we should harvest your lymph nodes and do really very severe set of operations. And we said, well, okay, what is your evidence for that? Why are you recommending that? He said, well, it's just what we do. So we got a second opinion by going to Sightman Cancer in St. Louis, and really enjoyed that because you could have a conversation with the surgeon. And we said, well, this is what the other surgeon said to do. What do you think of that? And he said, well, some people would do that, but if it were my wife, I would tell her not to. And we ended up with a much less radical surgery as a result, and a good outcome. It's hard to often know when someone is just telling you a good story and when they're actually giving you data. So think a little bit about the reasons for why something is being said. It's kind of, is there data behind this? Is the thing that I would comment on. A second way that you can have bias is by being persuaded by what comes to mind. Okay, and the term here is the availability heuristic, that I just happen to see this. So one way that you can become incredibly biased in this age of TikTok and Twitter and Facebook is all those things are designed so that you'll keep clicking on them and keep interacting with them. And articles will come up that are similar to articles that you did tend to come up with. And therefore, as a result, you might think that something is the way your social media feed tells you, when it's really not so. I guess this is not a science question, but it does speak to the availability heuristic. I have lots of people that I'm still friends with from rural Iowa, where I went to school. Many of these people are very upset at the election of Joe Biden. And I've often responded by saying, well, we had an election, and it looks like this is what the courts are doing. And they're still not having any of it, because they say, I don't know a single person who voted Democratic. It can't be the case that this election was fair. And the textbook gives a lot of examples that we tend to read the media. We tend to see health risks that are make for good journalism. One of the things I see every now and then now are reports of people having adverse reactions to the COVID vaccine. Well, nationally, I think there's like 3 or 4 of them of unexplained deaths. And we don't even know on those if it's just coincidence that out of thousands and thousands of people getting vaccinated, you're going to vaccinate someone immediately before some devastating medical condition raises its head. When you're looking at the larger set of data, though, the rates of complications associated with the vaccines are fairly small. So, again, as you're working through the inquisitive thing on this, and they read you scenarios or examples, it's that what's readily available. What did I just hear? Did my roommate, did my boyfriend, did my girlfriend just tell me about something? And I think, oh, well, because they said that, that's the way it is. They give you an example of the availability heuristic here that's concrete. If you're looking at this, there's a whole bunch of peanut M&Ms there. Well, which color is most frequently represented? And if you're a little bit like me, the first time I looked at it, well, maybe there's more red ones there. Well, actually, there are more blue ones. But just in a cursory fashion, just looking at it, you tend to go with what pops out for you more. And the blue M&Ms being on a blue background, they don't pop for you on the page. And the third one is present bias. In other words, you tend to make your conclusions based on what you see right before you at the time, and not to consider other factors that are involved. Myself, I think there's kind of a multicultural aspect to this. That, one example of present bias is, occurred while I was watching an educational situation where a girl was brought before the principal's office, and the principal was really, really hard on her. And I said, what's going on there? He said, well, I could tell she was lying because she didn't look me in the eye. She looked down at the floor. And I said, well, actually, not to mansplain to the principal, but I know that this girl comes from a Native American population, and you don't look at authority figures. And that's also probably present in other cultures as well. But because this person was not aware of the other variables, namely this culture in which the student grew up in, they weren't coming to the correct conclusion. It's a little bit like not thinking about all the confounds that could be present. you want a connection to other themes inside the chapter. Next, we have confirmation bias. And that's looking at the evidence you like to see. So I think I mentioned last time that I was doing a class with Joseph Lansing, who was an undergraduate, did his honors project, and we looked at how people use the internet when they're trying to find out information about things they're not certain of. And an awful lot of the time, people would say, well, the way I use the internet is I go out and I look around for websites that are the way I think about things. I will look at only MSNBC, or I will Google, are vaccines harmful, and click on the websites that describe vaccines being harmful. And that's not going to work, because you're always going to come up with the conclusion that you were looking for. And finally, being biased about being biased. That is, I guess, one thing that is kind of a funny story. My wife comes from the Boston area, and she and her siblings all say, well, we're really good drivers, but there's a lot of crazy people out there on the road. And I've had several sort of white knuckle experiences with my brother-in-laws at the wheel driving through Boston. And they seem, at least to my Midwestern eyes, pretty aggressive. And as a matter of fact, one time they were behind, there was a roundabout, it's a big circle that managed the traffic. And there was this car ahead of us, I believe it was from Michigan, and it was waiting very patiently for the traffic to clear so it could go out. And Mike, my brother-in-law, pulls up very slowly behind the car, touches the bumper, and pushes the car into traffic to make it go. So that's, but yet, Mike thinks of himself as, I'm a really good driver, just something I would never do. In the same fashion, there are examples in the book that talk about people thinking, oh, other people overestimate their intelligence, but I don't. Or, I think other people are prejudiced about minorities, but I'm certainly not. And that self-examination, that self-assessment is also a source of bias. You've probably heard of one psychology study that gets a lot of play that describes something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, that individuals who are actually poorest at performing overestimate their ability. They started out with this description of a bank robber who thought he was just a really smart bank robber. And they said, well, we arrested you because you didn't walk in even wearing a mask. We knew who you were right away, except for the fact that you had taken a Sharpie and drawn over your face for some reason. And he said, it didn't work. And they said, what didn't work? Well, somebody told me that if you write on your face with magic marker, that the security cameras won't be able to see you. This is not true. So that's in the same fashion, to some extent. I guess you can also say it cuts the other way. I've known very intelligent people who tend to underestimate their performance. So a big take-home message from this chapter is that you're going to make some mistakes if you use science, but you're going to make a lot more mistakes if we base our reasoning only on our intuition. And the way that we try to reduce the effects of intuitive reasoning is to gather some systematic data, to look at comparison groups, and consider as many variables as we can in making an interpretation. trusting authorities. Well, this is kind of one of my favorite pet peeves, especially in journalism, that I'm going to get experts on this side and experts on that side. And who can tell, we've got experts here and we've got experts there. It's not only, to some extent, you do have to use experts. Experts are sources of expertise. They know things about a situation that we don't know. Do I know all the personal ins and outs of, say, climate change science? No, I don't. But I do trust individuals who research in that area if they appear to be unbiased and appropriately cautious in their work. The current controversies about greening our vaccines or vaccine denial is also another area where there are supposed experts, but they're experts who come into this with an agenda, or much more of an agenda than others. So as you look at research, it's not a simple thing. Interviewing college freshmen at Missouri, when I talk to them about finding sources, they'll say, well, I don't know much about this, but I'll go to the library and try to find articles. And if I find 10 articles that say this and 5 articles that say that, I'll go with the one where I have 10. That you just, and then that's not going to work. You can't just simply count things. And I guess in this day and age with web things, you can certainly go in and count web hits. Evaluating the quality of the source is a really important step. Generally speaking, you probably want to have sources that are with professional organizations or government organizations before you have, say, a YouTube video from a medical doctor who wants to show you something. Finding scientific sources is something that we'll do later on in the class using PsycInfo and Google Scholar, and thinking a little bit about how to read that research. It's a little bit different to read a research article than it is to read a popular novel. Research also exists in less scholarly places, and be careful about that. But as I mentioned last time, there are things like preprint archives and individual blogs that researchers have that give you an idea for what's being done. This is a really nice little diagram in the book of, here's what I believe. And on the left-hand side, if I believe things based on experience, I've got confounds. I don't have a comparison group. It may be fairly idiosyncratic. If I believe things based on authority, though, I can't necessarily accept that because that could just be an authority's personal experience as well. Doctors are allowed to have opinions and lives, and the authority could be using their intuition, as I mentioned about my wife's first consult for cancer. So it's important to query based on the authority's research. And this is particularly hard in questions of medicine because people examining you are often under pressure to examine you quickly to get to the next patient. If we reason based on intuition, the blue box later on, there are the 5 different biases that you can look at. So as you go through the inquisitive, they'll have you talk about what those definitions are for those various bias sources, and then they'll show you some examples and have you classify those. So it's good to get some practice in spotting what those biases are. And the reason that it's good to do that here in this chapter is we're going to revisit that theme as we go through the rest of the chapters. Okay, so looking at the major orange branch in the middle, you can believe things based on research you have looked at. And those vary in terms of their quality. Probably the best quality information based on research is based on scientific sources. Journal articles are very helpful in this respect because they come out regularly. They're vetted very carefully. You can have some good degree of confidence in individual studies. Chapters in edited books are nice. It's a little bit of an issue there. Often chapters in edited books are written by senior researchers like myself, and being long-winded, it takes a little longer to get through them. The other way that a chapter is useful, though, is you have the time to actually lay out all of your argument. However, edited books often are not as reviewed as much as journal articles are. And that same issue also applies to full-length books. You can look for other sources that are out there. Journalists, lay people, TED Talks, for example, trade books, magazines, and so forth. And very frequently that will acquaint you with the primary literature. It's important, though, to know that maybe the person talking to you is not a trained scientist, and maybe the person talking to you has an agenda, and maybe the person talking to you misunderstands the degree to which this particular study generalizes. The book, for some odd reason, does not like Wikipedia that much. And I kind of come down thinking that Wikipedia is useful depending on what you're looking at. So in the areas of math and statistics, Wikipedia pages look pretty darn good to me. In other questions like politics and policy statements, it can be a little bit uneven, but read the references that flow from that. And these next few slides basically go through what I've just gotten done saying from the diagram. And if you're using PsycInfo and Google Scholar, we can't just type a few words and hit return. So inside of PsycInfo, there are preferred terms to search on. And it's also kind of good to find at least one research article and use that research article to get an idea of what terms you might search on in the future. So we'll be giving you some practice later on how to do that. And the same thing also applies to Google Scholar. This is another topic. When you're looking at a research article, there's this thing called APA style. And APA style has the following 6 sections. And it's important that you know what the names of these sections are and what order they come in. There's an abstract, about 100, 150 words, that describes the study in very, very brief fashion. An abstract is often the only thing that many people will read about a given study. There's an introduction that tells you what the literature in this area is and what the research question is going to be. That's also a place, the introduction is also a place you go to look for what's the theory that the researcher is using. The method is the nuts and bolts of the study. Who was assessed? What measurement instruments were used? How is it scored? What's the reliability of measurements that's going on? The results section contains your statistical analysis. Maybe that has some additional psychometrics and reliability, but here's where your t-test or analysis of variance gets reported and the statistical significance gets reported out. Often when I write things, I do the analysis and I also put some supplementary analyses in the back of the paper, just saying, well, when I run it this way and this way and this way, here's how my results would change, so that you can know that I've at least looked at some alternative explanations. The discussion section gives you the conclusions, and it's more than just, and here's my results. It's, here's what I found. Here are the limitations to what I found. This study is not perfect. It did not fall from heaven. Here are some limitations. Here are the ways that maybe you want to be cautious if you're trying to generalize this. And Here's some future directions that people working in this area might want to consider. And yet, despite all these limitations, at the end of the discussion section, you again repeat what the major conclusion from your study is that you believe can happen in spite of all these limitations and in spite of the fact that if you had it all to do over again, you probably would have done it a little bit differently. And the references are the bibliographic sections that say, what other research did you cite? References are also in something called APA style, and that has a fixed format that as you go into Research Methods 2 next semester over the summer, you'll find out, is a set of hard and fast rules for how you cite literature. And it's a little bit of detail work, but it's important detail work because that way other people can find the things that you've read. So when you're reading, as I mentioned, you're not supposed to necessarily just read this like a novel. As you read an article where somebody did a study, what is the argument? So in Brad Bushman's case, I've got my 3 conditions. If the catharsis model of aggression is true, then people should be less aggressive, the more they act out on that aggression. And think about the evidence that supports the argument. In his case, he did random assignment. So we know that it isn't just people who enjoy sitting in a chair quietly, maybe being more pacific toward other people than those who are asked, who by natural inclination would go punching a bag with Steve's face on it. Chapters and review articles follow much the same fashion. It's just that a review article starts out with clumps of surveys, clumps of studies that have been done, organized by topic. And the arguments that are made are more arguments taken across the larger body of the evidence. So some examples of what goes on in those types of articles is, yes, there are articles on this side and articles on that side. For example, there are articles that say childcare is harmful to children, and there are articles that say childcare is not harmful. And as you look at it, very frequently the articles that say childcare is harmful tended to be smaller studies of individual childcare services. And also people tended to be from lower SES backgrounds and they didn't control for that. So even though there are studies on both sides, what I'm saying is in a chapter or review article, you'll see more evaluation of the studies and the skeptical thinking that goes across many studies rather than just a single one. And as I mentioned before, by all means, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore, or Wiki, or the popular press is another place you can get things. But as I mentioned before, it's important to be a little cautious about that because very frequently they have agendas. And that, folks, is what I have for you today.